The plane was ready for takeoff. Passengers were settling into their seats, some excited, some exhausted. But in the middle of first class, something wasn't right. A flight attendant stood over a teenage girl, her arms crossed, her voice sharp. "You don't belong here, move to economy, now." The girl held up her ticket, first class, a window seat, paid in full. But the attendant shook her head. "I don't know how you got this, but this seat isn't for you." Humiliation settled in. Passengers watched but said nothing. Heart pounding, the girl picked up her bag and walked to the back of the plane, fighting back tears. But what the flight attendant didn't know, her father owned the entire airline. And when he found out what happened, justice would be served at 35,000 feet. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like stories where justice is served, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Amina sat by the window, gripping her boarding pass tightly. It was her first time flying alone, and she still felt the mix of excitement and nervousness bubbling inside her. The first-class seat was spacious, much more comfortable than the economy seat she was used to. Her father had given her this ticket as a reward, and she was proud of herself. She tucked her backpack under the seat in front of her, adjusted her hoodie and put in her earphones, ready to enjoy the flight. She didn't need to draw attention to herself. She was just another passenger, minding her own business. The aisle filled with people boarding, some chatting, others settling into their seats. As the cabin crew moved around, checking passengers, a flight attendant named Linda Thompson walked down the row, making sure seatbelts were fastened. She greeted passengers with polite smiles, but when her eyes landed on Amina, something in her expression shifted. She slowed down, her warm demeanor fading into something colder. Linda tilted her head, looking at Amina's casual clothes, then glanced at her seat number. She straightened her uniform, taking a deep breath. "Miss, I believe you're in the wrong section," Linda said, her voice firm but controlled. Amina looked up, slightly confused. "No, I think this is my seat," she said softly. She pulled out her ticket from her hoodie pocket and held it up. Linda took it, scanning it quickly. Her lips pressed together into a thin line. She hesitated just long enough to make it uncomfortable. Then, instead of handing it back, she exhaled sharply and shook her head. "There's been a mistake. This is a first-class ticket." Amina frowned. "I know." Linda's tone sharpened. "First class is reserved for premium passengers. This seat is not available." Passengers nearby shifted in their seats. Some were pretending not to listen, but others were now watching closely. A man across the aisle, Richard Evans, an older businessman, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Amina felt her stomach tighten. Why was she the only one being questioned? She had traveled before, and no one had ever spoken to her like this. "I promise, this is my seat," she said again, keeping her voice steady. Linda handed back the ticket, but her expression didn't soften. "Where are your parents?" The question hit Amina like a slap. She blinked. "I'm traveling alone." Linda gave a tight smile, but there was no kindness in it. "Who gave you this ticket?" Amina's face burned. Why did it matter? She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, Linda sighed like she was dealing with a stubborn child. "Look, I don't know how you got this, but first class is not for you. You need to move." Amina's throat tightened. "I don't understand. Why do I need to move?" "You don't belong in this section." The words were clear, direct. The passengers who had been watching quickly looked away. No one spoke up. No one defended her. She felt her pulse quicken, her hands clenching in her lap. She had followed every rule. She had her ticket. She wasn't causing trouble. And yet, she was being told right in front of everyone that she didn't belong. Linda placed her hands on her hips, her patience running thin. "If you don't move now, I will have to call security. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." A lump formed in Amina's throat. She could fight, she could argue, but would they even listen? Slowly she gathered her things, her fingers trembling. The humiliation settled deep in her chest as she walked down the aisle toward the economy section. Passengers avoided her gaze, some shifting uncomfortably, but no one said a word. As she reached the back of the plane, another flight attendant, Hannah Miller, noticed her. Hannah had seen the interaction from a distance, and something about it didn't sit right with her. She hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. "Miss, is everything all right?" Amina forced a small nod. "They told me I had to move," she mumbled, sliding into an empty seat. Hannah frowned. She had worked alongside Linda for years, and she knew how the woman handled certain passengers. Something about this didn't feel like a mistake. Amina sat back in her new seat, but it didn't feel right. The seat was cramped, the armrests hard, nothing like the comfort she had just been forced to leave behind. She stared at the back of the seat in front of her, gripping the straps of her backpack. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't let them see her break. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with shaky fingers and unlocked the screen. A message from her father, Daniel Carter, popped up. "Everything okay? Boarded yet?" She hesitated for a moment, then typed back. "They made me move. Said I couldn't sit in first class." A few seconds passed, then another buzz. "Who made you move?" She swallowed. "The flight attendant." There was a long pause before the next message appeared. "What's the flight number?" She told him. This wasn't over. Amina held her phone tightly, staring at her father's last message. She had seen him handle problems before, calm, precise, and always in control. But this time she wasn't sure what he could do. The plane was already in the air. The flight attendants had made it clear they didn't care about her ticket. What could he possibly do from the ground? She exhaled slowly, pushing her phone back into her pocket. The embarrassment still clung to her, but she forced herself to sit up straight. She wasn't going to let Linda see her looking defeated if she walked past again. A few rows ahead, Linda stood near the galley, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Another flight attendant, Hannah, approached her with a questioning look. "What was that about?" Hannah asked, nodding toward the economy section where Amina now sat. Linda barely glanced up. "Just fixing a seating mistake." Hannah frowned. It didn't look like a mistake. Linda sighed, stirring her coffee slowly. She didn't belong there. Probably got the ticket through some system error or someone gave it to her. You know how it is. Hannah's frown deepened. "Did you check the manifest?" Linda rolled her eyes. "I didn't need to." Hannah opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, the intercom crackled to life. "Ms. Thompson, please report to the cockpit immediately." Linda's hand paused over her coffee cup. The captain never called flight attendants to the cockpit unless something serious was happening. She straightened her uniform, giving Hannah a final look before heading toward the front of the plane. Inside the cockpit, Captain James Reynolds turned to face her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't alone. On the in-flight phone screen, a man's face was visible. His features were sharp, his suit crisp, his posture tense. It took Linda a second to realize who she was looking at. Daniel Carter, the owner of the airline. Her stomach twisted. "Ms. Thompson," the captain said, his voice steady, "we have received a direct complaint regarding your handling of a first-class passenger." Linda swallowed. "Captain, The man on the screen cut her off. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. "You removed my daughter from her assigned seat," Daniel Carter said. Linda's mouth went dry. "You told her she didn't belong," he continued. "Would you like to explain why?" For the first time in her career, Linda was at a loss for words. The realization hit her all at once. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had just humiliated the daughter of the most powerful man in the airline industry. And now she was about to face the consequences. Linda's hands felt clammy as she stood in the cockpit, her breath coming a little faster than usual. Her mind raced, searching for a way to explain herself. She had handled plenty of difficult passengers before, but this wasn't just any passenger. This was the owner's daughter, and she had kicked her out of first class. Captain Reynolds sat quietly, watching her with an unreadable expression. He had already been briefed on the situation, but he wasn't going to interfere. This was between Linda and Daniel Carter now. Linda straightened her posture, forcing a polite smile. "Mr. Carter, there was a misunderstanding. The girl, Amina, She didn't appear to be a first-class passenger. I was only following protocol. Daniel's expression didn't change. His eyes remained cold. Protocol? Linda nodded quickly. Yes, sir. I was ensuring that all passengers were in their assigned seats. I didn't mean to offend anyone. There was a brief silence. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice even lower. Did you ask anyone else in first class to prove they belonged there? Linda hesitated. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She could feel the weight of the question pressing down on her. She knew the answer, so did Daniel. No, he said for her. You didn't. She swallowed hard. It wasn't about that. I assumed there was a mistake. That's the problem, Daniel interrupted. You assumed. Linda felt the air in the cockpit grow heavier. She had prided herself on being a senior flight attendant for years. She knew the rules, the procedures, and how to manage difficult situations. But now, for the first time, she realized she had made a decision based on something other than company policy. Daniel's voice remained controlled, but there was an unmistakable authority behind it. You embarrassed my daughter in front of an entire cabin. You ignored her valid ticket. You treated her differently. Linda clenched her jaw, but she couldn't argue. The truth was right there, and she had no way out of it. Daniel's tone didn't rise, but it turned sharper. Here's what's going to happen. You will personally walk back to my daughter, apologize in front of the passengers, and escort her back to her first-class seat. Linda's stomach twisted. Apologize? In front of everyone? She could already picture the whispers, the looks of judgment. If you fail to do this, Daniel continued, you will not only be removed from this flight upon landing, but you will also be facing a full disciplinary hearing. Linda inhaled sharply. That wasn't a warning. That was a promise. The captain, who had been silent this entire time, finally spoke. Do you understand, Ms. Thompson? Linda's throat was dry, but she forced herself to nod. Yes, I understand. Daniel didn't say another word. The call ended with a soft click. Linda turned toward the cockpit door, her legs feeling strangely weak. She had no choice now. She had to go back, and she had to face Amina. Linda walked out of the cockpit, her hands clenched at her sides. She could feel the stares from the other flight attendants as she passed, but she kept her head high, trying to maintain whatever dignity she had left. Inside, her stomach churned. She had been working in the airline industry for years, always the one in control, always the one making the rules. Now she was being ordered, no, forced, to publicly correct her mistake. She made her way down the aisle, her polished heels clicking against the floor. The passengers in first class barely noticed her at first, absorbed in their conversations, their meals, or their screens. But as she continued walking, past the luxurious, spacious seats and toward the economy section, whispers started to spread. Amina sat stiffly in her cramped seat near the back, her arms crossed over her chest. She wasn't scrolling on her phone anymore. She wasn't reading. She was just staring at the seat in front of her, her mind replaying what had happened over and over. She heard the footsteps before she saw her. Linda stopped in the aisle next to her row, clearing her throat. A few passengers nearby shifted in their seats, sensing something was about to happen. Amina turned her head slowly, her face unreadable. Linda forced a tight smile. Miss Carter, she said, her voice quieter than before. There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class. Amina didn't move. She just stared at Linda, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp. Linda's skin prickled under the weight of the silence. She could feel the nearby passengers listening in, waiting to see what would happen next. I apologize for any inconvenience, she added quickly, her voice strained. Amina blinked, tilting her head slightly. You're saying it was a misunderstanding? Linda nodded stiffly. Yes, there was. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. An error in seating. An error. That was the best excuse she could come up with. Amina studied her for a long moment before responding, her voice soft but firm. I had my ticket. You saw it. And you still told me to move. A few passengers exchanged looks. They had heard everything earlier. They knew Amina was right. Linda's throat felt dry. She had been prepared to say a quick apology, have Amina return to first class and be done with it. But this girl wasn't going to make it easy. I may have made a mistake in judgment, Linda said carefully, forcing the words out. Amina still didn't move. Instead, she reached for her phone, typing something quickly. Linda felt another wave of unease wash over her. Then, Amina finally looked at her again. "I'll go back," she said, standing up, her voice steady. "But I want to know why you thought I didn't belong there." Linda stiffened. I didn't think." "But you did," Amina interrupted. Her voice wasn't raised, but something about the way she spoke made Linda's palms sweat. "You didn't ask anyone else in first class for their ticket. Just me. Why?" Linda opened her mouth, then shut it again. The passengers around them were silent now, all waiting for her answer. Amina slung her backpack over her shoulder and stepped into the aisle. "If you're going to apologize, at least tell the truth." Linda felt her face burn. She had spent years controlling situations like this, making the rules, keeping things in order. But now, she wasn't in control at all. She had never expected a teenager to hold this much power over her. She took a shaky breath. I misjudged you." Amina didn't say anything. She let the words sit there, let Linda feel the weight of them. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the front of the plane. The walk back to first class wasn't a victory march. It wasn't smug or arrogant. It was quiet, dignified, and somehow that made it even more powerful. The first-class passengers turned as Amina entered, some looking surprised, others quickly looking away, embarrassed that they had witnessed the earlier humiliation and done nothing. Linda followed behind, feeling smaller with every step. Amina reached her seat, sat down, and calmly placed her bag beside her. She didn't thank Linda. She didn't need to. Linda stood there awkwardly, uncertain what to say next. "If there's anything you need," she mumbled, "please let me know." Amina simply opened her book and flipped to the next page. Linda turned stiffly and hurried back toward the galley, her face burning with humiliation. She had never felt so exposed before, so completely stripped of authority. She had spent years making quick judgments about passengers, and it had never backfired like this. But this time she hadn't just offended any passenger. She had humiliated the daughter of the most powerful man in the airline business. And now, she had to wait for whatever came next. Linda walked briskly back to the galley, her heart pounding. She had done what was asked of her, apologized, escorted Amina back. But she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The humiliation of being forced to publicly admit her mistake still clung to her like a heavy coat. She tried to steady her breath, but her hands still trembled slightly. Hannah stood near the beverage cart, watching her with a knowing look. She had seen everything. The forced apology, the power shift, the way Linda had been stripped of her usual authority. "That didn't go well, did it?" Hannah said, raising an eyebrow. Linda shot her a glare. "I don't need your commentary right now." Hannah smirked. "Just saying. You might want to sit down before you collapse. You look a little pale." Linda ignored her, grabbing a cup and filling it with water. She sipped it quickly, trying to calm herself. But the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. She had no idea what was waiting for her when they landed, but she knew one thing. Daniel Carter wasn't the type to let things slide. Meanwhile, Amina sat comfortably in her first-class seat, flipping through the in-flight magazine. Though she wasn't really reading, she could feel the shift in energy around her. The same people who had ignored her before were now stealing glances at her. Some looked uncomfortable, some seemed embarrassed, a few even looked guilty. An older man, Richard Evans, cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward her. I saw what happened earlier," he said hesitantly. Amina glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Did you?" He nodded awkwardly. "Yes, that was unfortunate." Amina raised an eyebrow. "Unfortunate?" Richard cleared his throat again, obviously uncomfortable. Yes, well, it was clearly a mistake on the flight attendant's part. Amina studied him for a moment, then gave a small, unimpressed smile. A mistake? Or a choice? Richard shifted in his seat, gripping the stem of his wine glass a little tighter. He didn't answer. Amina didn't push it. She simply returned to her magazine, letting the silence stretch. Her phone vibrated in her lap. She picked it up and read the message. Dad, we land in 45 minutes. Sit tight. A small smile curled at the corner of her lips. Oh, I will, she thought. At the front of the plane, the in-flight phone buzzed again. Linda flinched at the sound. She already knew who it was. She lifted the receiver to her ear. This is Ms. Thompson. A deep, calm voice spoke on the other end. This is Daniel Carter. Linda gripped the phone tighter. His voice wasn't raised. It wasn't angry, but there was something in his tone that made the air feel heavier. You will personally file a full incident report as soon as this flight lands, he said smoothly. I expect a detailed explanation of why my daughter was removed from her seat, despite having a valid ticket. Linda swallowed hard. Mr. Carter, You will also make sure that for the rest of this flight, she receives exactly the service that every other first-class passenger gets, he continued. Nothing less. Linda's fingers tightened around the phone. Yes, sir. The call ended with a soft click. Linda placed the phone back on the hook and leaned against the counter, her palms clammy. She had made a serious mistake, one she couldn't take back. And now she wasn't just dealing with a difficult passenger. She was dealing with the man who owned the sky she was flying in. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky, but inside the cabin the tension was growing thicker by the minute. Linda stood frozen in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter as reality settled in. She had always been the one enforcing the rules, making passengers comply, ensuring that first class was reserved for those who belonged there. But now, for the first time in her career, she was on the other side of the equation, being judged, being scrutinized, and worst of all, being powerless. Hannah leaned against the beverage cart, arms crossed. She had been working with Linda for a long time, but she had never seen her this rattled before. You're really sweating this, huh? She said casually. Linda turned sharply. I don't need your input right now. Hannah shrugged. Suit yourself, but I'd start thinking about what you're going to say when we land. Because Mr. Carter, he doesn't seem like the type to let this slide. Linda clenched her jaw, ignoring the comment. She grabbed a tray and began pouring a glass of sparkling water, determined to act normal, to pretend she still had control. She had orders to follow now. She had to make sure Amina was treated like every other first-class passenger. She forced her hands to stay steady as she walked back down the aisle, carrying the drink. Amina didn't acknowledge her at first. She was scrolling through her phone, looking completely relaxed. That more than anything made Linda's stomach twist. The girl wasn't upset. She wasn't angry. She was just waiting. Linda cleared her throat. Miss Carter, she said, placing the glass of sparkling water on the tray table. Can I get you anything else? Amina slowly lifted her gaze, studying her for a moment. A drink? She asked, as if surprised. Linda nodded quickly. Yes, anything you'd like. We have fresh juice, tea, coffee. Amina tilted her head slightly. You didn't ask me that before. Linda stiffened. Excuse me? When I first sat down, Amina said, her voice calm, you didn't offer me anything. You didn't even greet me like you did with the other first-class passengers. She glanced around the cabin. But now you're offering? Linda's face burned. She wasn't used to being questioned like this. She wasn't used to passengers holding her accountable. I apologize if I wasn't as welcoming before, Linda said, forcing the words out. I assure you it wasn't intentional. Amina didn't say anything for a long moment. She simply watched Linda, her expression unreadable. Then, after a pause, she gave a small shrug. I'll have a sparkling water. Linda nodded quickly, relieved that the conversation was over. But as she turned to leave, Amina's voice stopped her. "By the way," she said, lifting her phone slightly, "I texted my dad about you." The words sent a fresh wave of dread through Linda's stomach. She forced a small, tight smile. "I see." Amina took a slow sip of her drink, watching her. Yeah, he wasn't happy. Linda already knew that. She had heard his voice on the phone just minutes ago, but hearing Amina say it so casually with that quiet confidence made her stomach turn even more. "I guess we'll see what happens when we land," Amina added, setting her glass down. Linda stiffened, nodding quickly before retreating back toward the front of the cabin. She had never wanted a flight to end so badly in her entire career, but she had a sinking feeling that her problems were only just beginning. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but Linda barely heard it. She sat in the galley, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had never felt this powerless before. She had always been the one giving instructions, setting the tone, making sure things ran smoothly. But now she was just waiting for the plane to land, waiting for what was coming next. Hannah, still standing nearby, watched her with quiet amusement. "You should probably sit down before you collapse," she muttered. Linda shot her a glare. "I don't need your comments, Hannah." Hannah raised her hands in surrender, but there was a smirk on her lips. "I'm just saying, she handled that better than you did." Linda exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers to her temples. She didn't need Hannah rubbing salt in the wound. She needed a way to fix this. But deep down she knew it was too late for that. Meanwhile, back in first class, Amina scrolled through her phone, still calm, still unbothered. She had already won. The moment she sent that first text to her father, she knew the situation was out of Linda's hands. Now, all she had to do was sit back and watch. A few seats away, Richard Evans, the older businessman who had spoken to her earlier, glanced over again. He hesitated before clearing his throat. I just wanted to say," he began awkwardly, "that I should have spoken up earlier." Amina looked at him, raising an eyebrow. "But you didn't." Richard shifted in his seat. "No, I didn't," he exhaled. Sometimes you don't realize what's happening in the moment, you know. But looking back, I should have said something." Amina studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, you should have." Richard nodded back, his face tinged with quiet embarrassment. He didn't try to justify it. He didn't make excuses. And somehow, that was enough. Amina returned to her phone. Another text from her father popped up. "Dad, we land in 30 minutes. Let me know if you need anything before then." Amina smirked slightly as she typed back, "I'm good, just watching things unfold." At the front of the plane, Linda flinched as the in-flight phone rang again. She already knew who it was. With a shaky breath, she picked up the receiver. "This is Ms. Thompson." The deep voice on the other end was calm, measured, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. "This is Daniel Carter," he said. Linda swallowed. "Once we land," Daniel continued, "you will not be disembarking with the rest of the crew. You will remain on the aircraft until security meets you at the gate." Linda's stomach dropped. "Sir, I expect full compliance," Daniel said, cutting her off. "Do I make myself clear?" Linda's throat was dry. "Yes, sir." The line went dead. She slowly placed the phone back on the hook, her hands trembling. Hannah raised an eyebrow. "Bad news?" Linda shot her a look, but she didn't have the energy to respond. Because for the first time she realized this wasn't just about one mistake. This was about to become the biggest mistake of her career. The descent had begun, and the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign echoed through the cabin. Passengers casually adjusted their trays, shut down their screens, and prepared for landing. But for Linda, every second felt like a ticking time bomb. She remained in the galley, staring at the floor, her stomach twisting. Security would be waiting for her. She had no idea what that meant exactly, but she knew one thing. Her job was on the line. Hannah walked past, stopping just long enough to glance at her. "You look like you're going to be sick." Linda shot her a sharp look, but said nothing. Meanwhile, in first class, Amina buckled her seatbelt, glancing out the window as the city lights came into view. She could feel the energy in the cabin shifting. Passengers who had witnessed her humiliation earlier were now hyper-aware of her presence, though none of them dared to speak. Her phone buzzed. "Dad, stay seated. Security is waiting at the gate." Amina's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. At the front of the plane, the in-flight phone rang once more. Linda flinched but forced herself to answer. "This is Ms. Thompson," she said, her voice tight. It was the captain. "Ms. Thompson, security has confirmed their arrival. Upon landing, you are to remain on board until they escort you out. Understood?" Linda's grip tightened on the phone. She wanted to protest, to insist that this was being blown out of proportion, but she knew it wouldn't matter. "Understood," she said quietly. The line went dead. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling along the runway before slowing to a stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers immediately reached for their bags, eager to disembark. But as the doors unlocked and the flight attendants prepared for departure, a uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane. The sight alone was enough to cause murmurs among the passengers. Some stole quick glances, others openly watched, curious about what was happening. The officer walked straight past the first-class section, past the business-class passengers, past the others waiting to leave. He stopped in front of the galley. "Ms. Thompson?" His voice was calm but firm. Linda's breath hitched. Slowly, stiffly, she stepped forward. "Yes?" The officer's expression remained unreadable. "You'll need to come with us." A few passengers audibly gasped. Others exchanged looks, whispering amongst themselves. Linda swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, forcing a weak smile. The officer didn't blink. "Mr. Carter has requested a formal review of the incident regarding the removal of a first-class passenger. You'll be escorted for questioning." The weight of the moment crashed down on her. She had spent years building her career, climbing the ranks, making herself indispensable. And now she was the one being escorted off the plane. Her legs felt like lead as she walked down the aisle. Passengers watched, whispering in hushed tones, some with quiet amusement, others with disapproval. As she neared the first-class section, she made the mistake of glancing at Amina. Amina wasn't smug. She wasn't grinning or gloating. She simply watched, calm, composed, and somehow that made it worse. Linda tore her gaze away and kept walking. As she stepped off the plane, the weight of everything truly settled in. She had lost control. She had lost her position. And now, she had to face the consequences. The moment Linda stepped off the plane, the bright lights of the terminal felt like a spotlight shining directly on her. The security officers flanked her on either side, their pace steady but firm. She could feel the eyes of airport staff and passengers as they turned to watch, some whispering, others openly staring. She had walked through this airport countless times before, always with confidence, always in control. But now she felt exposed like a criminal being escorted through the terminal. At the end of the jet bridge, two airline executives stood waiting. Their expressions were unreadable, their arms crossed in silent judgment. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and a sharp suit, stepped forward. "Ms. Thompson," he said, his voice cool but professional. "Come with us." Linda swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. The security officers stepped aside, allowing the executives to take over. She followed them through a restricted door leading into the private corridors of the airport, the areas regular passengers never saw. The walls were sterile, the air thick with the smell of coffee and jet fuel. They reached a small conference room. Inside, a long table stretched across the center, a few chairs neatly arranged. The airline's logo was displayed on the wall behind the head seat. One of the executives gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Linda hesitated for a split second before obeying. The silver-haired man took the seat across from her, clasping his hands together. His name tag read James Connors, Senior Operations Manager. She had met him once before in passing, but now he looked at her with nothing but cold scrutiny. "You do realize why you're here, correct?" he asked, Linda straightened in her seat, trying to regain whatever authority she had left. I was informed there was a complaint about a seating issue. James's lips pressed into a thin line. A seating issue? He repeated, his voice carrying a slight edge. Ms. Thompson, do you understand who you removed from first class? She forced herself to hold his gaze. I do now. Do you? James tilted his head slightly. Because this isn't just about a mistake. This is about why that mistake happened. Linda's fingers curled around the arms of the chair. You didn't mean to humiliate the daughter of the airline's owner? James interrupted. Or you didn't mean to assume she didn't belong in first class? Her throat tightened. Silence stretched between them. James leaned forward, his gaze sharp. Let's be clear, Ms. Thompson. This is not about a simple seating mix-up. If it were, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. This is about why you questioned her ticket when you didn't question anyone else's. This is about why you spoke to her with a tone you wouldn't have used on another passenger. Linda's jaw clenched. I was just following protocol. James scoffed, shaking his head. No, you weren't. Protocol requires that if there's an issue with seating, you check the manifest first. You didn't do that, did you? Linda stayed silent. You also didn't radio the gate agent to verify the ticket, James continued. You made a decision based purely on assumption, and then, to make matters worse, you spoke down to a minor in front of the entire first-class cabin. Linda felt heat rise to her cheeks. She wanted to defend herself, to say that it wasn't that serious, that it wasn't intentional. But how could she argue when the evidence was stacked against her? James exhaled through his nose, leaning back in his chair. You've been with this airline for how long? 10 years, she answered quietly. 10 years, he repeated. That's a long time. Long enough to know how things work. Long enough to know better. The words hit harder than she expected. James pulled out a folder and flipped it open. Inside were documents, statements from passengers, a report from the captain, and worst of all, a printed complaint directly from Daniel Carter himself. James tapped the paper with 2 fingers. Mr. Carter has already made it clear that this incident will not be ignored. Linda's breath hitched. What does that mean? It means, James said evenly, that as of now you are suspended without pay, pending a full review by the board. Her stomach dropped. Suspended? Yes. His tone remained cold. A final decision will be made within the week, but I wouldn't be optimistic if I were you. Linda's hands trembled slightly. I've given 10 years to this airline. You can't just... James's eyes darkened. Ms. Thompson, if this were any other passenger, we'd still be having this conversation. The only difference is, it wouldn't be just suspension. It would be immediate termination. Her mouth opened, then closed. James sighed, rubbing his temple. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. You might have a chance to appeal if you take full accountability, if you admit your mistake and show that you're willing to learn from it. But if you sit here making excuses, defending yourself, then this is the end of your career in aviation. Linda swallowed hard. She had spent years building her reputation, climbing the ranks, thinking she was untouchable. But now everything she had worked for was hanging by a thread. James studied her for a moment before closing the folder. That's all for now. You'll be escorted out of the airport. A formal letter will be sent to your email by tomorrow. He stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. Linda, still frozen in shock, slowly rose from her seat. Her knees felt weak. She wanted to argue, to demand another chance, but she knew it wouldn't matter. A security officer stepped back into the room, waiting to escort her out. As she turned to leave, James spoke one last time. Maybe next time, before you judge someone by how they look, he said coolly. You'll think twice. Linda didn't reply. She walked out of the room, her head low, her stomach twisted in knots, and for the first time in 10 years, she had no idea what her future looked like. Linda walked through the airport terminal in a daze, each step feeling heavier than the last. The security officer at her side didn't speak, didn't offer any words of comfort or reassurance. There was nothing to say. She had heard her fate loud and clear, and the reality of it was settling in like a lead weight in her chest. Suspended, without pay. Her hands clenched into fists as she navigated through the terminal, ignoring the stares from passing employees and travelers. Some people had already heard what happened. News like this traveled fast in the airline industry, especially when it involved someone as powerful as Daniel Carter. She had always walked through these halls with a sense of authority, head held high, her uniform pristine. But now, she felt like an outsider. When she reached the exit doors, she hesitated. The airport had been her second home. She had spent years inside these walls, working tirelessly, making sure flights ran smoothly, ensuring passengers followed the rules. But now she was the one being removed, like a problem that needed to be handled. The security officer cleared his throat, gesturing toward the exit. Without another word, she stepped outside, the cool air hitting her skin as the doors slid shut behind her. The noise of the city filled her ears, honking cars, distant chatter, the hum of planes overhead. She had never felt more alone. Inside the airport, things were moving quickly. Amina sat in the first-class lounge, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp. She had been escorted here shortly after the plane landed, per her father's request. The lounge was quiet and elegant, filled with plush leather chairs and warm lighting. A few passengers were scattered around, sipping coffee and checking their phones, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through the terminal. She wasn't waiting long. A few minutes later, the glass doors slid open, and in walked the man she had been waiting for, Daniel Carter. He carried himself with the same quiet authority he always had, tall, well-dressed, his presence alone commanding respect. He was a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His words carried weight simply because of who he was. As he approached, Amina stood, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Hey, Dad." He gave her a long look, then sighed, pulling her into a brief but firm hug. "You okay?" She nodded. "I'm good." He pulled back, studying her face, making sure she wasn't just saying that to make him feel better. "They didn't mess with you after you went back to first class?" She smirked. "Nope. I think they were too scared." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "They should be." They both sat down, the tension in the air finally beginning to ease. "So," he said, folding his hands in front of him. "Tell me everything." Amina recounted the entire story. The moment Linda approached her, the way she dismissed her ticket, the humiliation of being forced to move. She kept her tone even, never exaggerating, never making it more dramatic than it needed to be. Her father listened intently, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt, didn't react with sudden anger, but Amina knew him well enough to see the fire burning behind his eyes. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "She's suspended," he said simply. "Indefinitely." Amina raised an eyebrow. "Just suspended?" He met her gaze. "For now." She considered that. "You're giving her a chance to explain herself." He nodded. "I believe in accountability, but I also believe in fairness. She needs to own up to what she did. If she does, then maybe she can fix herself. If she doesn't," he shrugged, "then she won't work for this airline ever again." Amina leaned back in her chair, processing that. "Do you think she will own up to it?" Daniel exhaled, rubbing his chin. "Some people don't learn until they lose everything." Amina thought about Linda's face when she had come to apologize, the tension in her voice, the way she had tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding. It wasn't. It was a choice, a bad one. "She won't get her job back," Amina said confidently. "People like her never admit they were wrong." Daniel gave a small, thoughtful nod. "We'll see." He glanced at his watch. "I have a meeting with the board in an hour. We're going to implement new policies because of this." Amina raised an eyebrow. "New policies?" Her father nodded. "Bias training, more oversight on first-class treatment, and a stronger system for passengers to report discrimination. This isn't just about you, Amina. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Amina felt a strange sense of pride settle in her chest. This wasn't just about punishing Linda. It was about change. She picked up her drink, taking a slow sip. So, basically, she just helped make the airline better. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. Ironic, isn't it? Amina smirked. Karma's funny like that. Her father's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then sighed. They're ready for me. He stood up, adjusting his suit. You coming with me or heading home? Amina stretched, standing as well. I think I'll stick around. I want to see what happens next. Daniel smiled. That's my girl. They walked out of the lounge together, side by side, the weight of the day settling behind them. But for Linda Thompson, her storm was just beginning. Linda sat alone in her apartment, staring blankly at her laptop screen. The formal suspension notice sat in her inbox, the words bold and cold. Effective immediately. You are placed on unpaid suspension pending further review. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the email, her stomach churning. She had spent 10 years with the airline, moving up in ranks, gaining seniority, being respected. And now, it had all crumbled in a matter of hours. The world outside her window moved on without her. People walking, cars honking, the city breathing. But for Linda, everything had stopped. Her phone buzzed. Hannah. She hesitated before answering. What? There was a pause. Then Hannah's voice came through, casual as always. Just checking in. How's unemployment treating you? Linda exhaled sharply. I'm suspended, not fired. For now, Hannah said. So, what's your plan? Linda pressed her fingers against her temple. I don't know, I need to think. Think about what? Hannah asked. Whether you should beg for your job back or pretend none of this happened? Linda gritted her teeth. You don't get it. Oh, I get it, Hannah replied smoothly. You got caught. You've been doing this for years, acting like you run the cabin, treating some passengers differently than others, making judgments before even checking a ticket. But this time, you messed with the wrong person. Linda's jaw tightened. I didn't mean to. Hannah laughed. That's the thing, Linda. You did mean to. Maybe not in a plotting evil way. But you made a decision. You saw a black girl in first class, and instead of assuming she belonged, you assumed she didn't. That was your mistake. Silence. For the first time, Linda didn't have a response. Hannah sighed. Look, I don't hate you. But if you want to survive this, you need to own it. The airline is giving you a chance to explain yourself. But if you keep pretending this wasn't what it was, you're done. Linda swallowed, staring at the email again. I have to go, she muttered. Yeah, you do, Hannah said. Think about it, Linda. The call ended. Linda sat back, her eyes on the screen, the weight of the situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had a choice. She could keep fighting, keep making excuses, or she could finally admit the truth. Linda closed her laptop, but the words from Hannah still echoed in her head. You made a decision. She hated to admit it, but deep down she knew Hannah was right. She had spent years making quick judgments about passengers, deciding who belonged and who didn't, often without realizing the weight of her actions. This time she had been caught. This time it had cost her everything. Her phone buzzed again, but she ignored it. She needed to think. For years she had told herself she was just following protocol. But was that really true? Had she ever second-guessed herself when questioning certain passengers? Had she ever looked at a well-dressed businessman or a wealthy older woman and assumed they didn't belong? But she had looked at Amina and assumed exactly that. She rubbed her temples, frustration building inside her. The airline was offering her one chance to take accountability, to own up to what she did. If she refused, she already knew the outcome. She'd be fired permanently. The idea of losing everything terrified her. She had worked too hard for this job, spent too many years climbing the ranks, sacrificed too much. She wasn't ready to let it go. Linda exhaled sharply and grabbed her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Was she really going to do this? Her pride screamed at her to put the phone down, to find another way, to wait and see if the airline would forget about all of this in a few weeks. But a stronger voice, the one that told her she had been wrong, pushed her forward. She pressed the call button. The line rang twice before a calm, deep voice answered. "This is Daniel Carter." Linda's stomach twisted. This was the last person she wanted to talk to, but she forced herself to speak. "Mr. Carter, this is Linda Thompson." A brief silence. Then, his voice sharp but composed. "I'm listening." Linda took a breath. This was it. "I need to speak with you, and with Amina." "Why?" Daniel asked, his tone unreadable. Linda swallowed hard. "Because I owe her an apology, a real one." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Linda could hear the faint murmur of voices in the background, probably from Daniel Carter's office. For a moment she thought he might just hang up, dismiss her completely, but then he spoke, his tone unreadable. "Why now?" Linda gripped the phone tighter. "Because I need to do the right thing." Silence stretched between them again. Daniel finally sighed. "Meet me at the corporate office tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp." Linda exhaled, relief washing over her. "Yes, sir. Thank you." The call ended. She set her phone down and stared at the wall. The hardest part was yet to come. The next morning, Linda sat in the waiting area of the Carter Aviation corporate headquarters, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had walked into this building many times before, attending meetings, training sessions, and briefings. But today, she was here for judgment. The receptionist finally gestured toward the conference room doors. "You can go in now." Linda stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. She took a deep breath and walked inside. The room was modern and spacious, the walls lined with aviation-themed artwork. Seated at the long glass table was Daniel Carter, his presence commanding as always, and next to him, sitting with a composed expression, was Amina. Linda hesitated. The last time she had seen Amina, the girl had been calm, powerful, and completely in control of the situation. Now she was sitting across from her, waiting. Daniel folded his hands together and gestured for Linda to sit. She lowered herself into the chair, her throat dry. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then Daniel leaned back, his sharp gaze locked onto Linda. "You asked for this meeting, so talk." Linda swallowed. This was it. No excuses, no scripted corporate apologies, just the truth. She turned to Amina. "I was wrong," she said quietly. "I shouldn't have questioned your ticket, I shouldn't have treated you differently, and I definitely shouldn't have embarrassed you in front of an entire cabin." Amina watched her carefully. "Why did you?" The question hit harder than Linda expected. She could lie. She could say it wasn't personal. She could claim it was just a mistake. But she already knew the truth. She dropped her gaze for a moment, gathering her words. When she looked back up, she spoke honestly. "Because I made a judgment about you the second I saw you. I didn't even think twice, and that's on me." Daniel remained silent, studying her closely. Linda let out a slow breath. "I didn't mean to treat you unfairly, but the truth is, that doesn't matter. What matters is that I did." Amina didn't say anything right away. She just nodded slightly, as if she had already known the answer, but wanted to hear Linda say it out loud. Linda sat still, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. Then finally Daniel spoke. "So what now?" Linda felt the weight of Daniel Carter's question settle over her. So what now? What now? She had already admitted she was wrong. She had taken responsibility, something she never thought she would have to do. But was that enough? Would an apology be enough to erase what had happened? She looked at Amina again, searching for an answer in the young girl's face. Amina sat there, unreadable, her fingers lightly tapping against the conference table. She'd been in control of the situation from the moment the plane landed, and even now she held all the power. Linda took a breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said carefully. "And I know that saying sorry doesn't undo what I did, but I want to make this right." Amina tilted her head slightly. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Linda swallowed, glancing at Daniel, but his face remained unreadable. This wasn't going to be easy. She had spent her entire career giving orders, not asking for second chances. But now, she was the one on the other side. "I want to be better," she admitted. "I want to understand what I did wrong, beyond just this incident. I don't want this to happen again, not just to you, but to anyone else." Amina narrowed her eyes slightly. "You sound like you're reading from a corporate handbook." Linda flinched. "I'm not. I mean it." For the first time, Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You had no problem making assumptions about my daughter," he said smoothly. "Now let me make one about you." Linda tensed but didn't speak. "You didn't think twice about asking Amina to move," Daniel continued. "That means this wasn't just a one-time mistake. This was a pattern, a way of thinking you've probably had for years. You're comfortable making snap decisions about people based on how they look." Linda wanted to protest, to defend herself. But what could she say? He was right. Daniel sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Do you even know how many complaints have been filed about you?" Linda's stomach dropped. Complaints. She had never been formally reprimanded. She had never received an official warning. She had assumed she had an untarnished record. I don't know," she admitted hesitantly. Daniel slid a folder across the table toward her. Linda stared at it, heart pounding. Slowly, she opened it. Inside were printed reports, passenger complaints, written statements from previous flights. Her hands shook as she read the words. "Flight attendant seemed dismissive when I asked for assistance. She checked my ticket twice but didn't do the same for anyone else. I felt unwelcome in first class." The complaints weren't just about Amina. There were dozens of them. Linda's mouth went dry. I never saw these before." Daniel gave her a knowing look. "Because no one ever pushed for them to be reviewed. Until now." Linda flipped through the pages, her face heating up. Had she really been like this for so long? Had she ignored people's discomfort because she never thought it was a problem? She'd always thought of herself as a professional, someone who knew her job well. But looking at these complaints, she saw a different picture. Amina leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "So tell me, Ms. Thompson," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Now that you know this wasn't just a mistake, what do you plan to do about it?" Linda's throat tightened. She had come here expecting to apologize. She hadn't expected to have her entire career laid out in front of her like a case file. She could feel Daniel watching her, waiting. He wasn't just going to hand her job back because she said she was sorry. If she wanted to prove she had changed, she had to do more than just talk. She had to act. She closed the folder, her hands still shaking slightly. "I don't have an answer for you yet," she admitted. "But I want to find one." Amina studied her for a long moment. Then she gave the smallest hint of a nod. Daniel exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "I'll be honest, Ms. Thompson. I don't think you're ready to come back to work. Not yet." Linda swallowed, bracing herself for what was coming next. "But," Daniel continued, "I'm willing to give you a choice." Linda's breath caught in her throat. Daniel folded his hands together. "You can take your suspension and walk away. Find another airline. Start over somewhere else. Pretend this never happened." A pause. "Or," he said, "you take the next few months and do the work. Real training, real bias education, real accountability. And when and if you can prove you've changed, we'll consider your reinstatement." Linda stared at him. "You're giving me a second chance?" Daniel's expression remained firm. "Number, I'm giving you the opportunity to earn one." Amina raised an eyebrow. "If you're really serious about being better, then prove it." Linda's heart pounded in her chest. She had walked into this meeting expecting punishment, expecting a final decision. Instead, she was being given a choice, a hard one, because starting over somewhere else would be easier. But if she truly wanted to change, if she truly wanted to make things right, she knew which path she had to take. Linda took a slow, deep breath. Then she made her decision. Linda sat frozen in her chair, staring at Daniel Carter. The room felt colder now, heavier, like the walls were pressing in on her. He had given her a choice. She could walk away, start fresh at another airline, maybe one that wouldn't look too hard at why she left. Maybe she could pretend this whole thing never happened. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. This wasn't something she could just move past. The folder in front of her, the complaints from passengers over the years, was proof of that. This wasn't about one mistake. This was about a pattern. Amina sat across from her, quiet, waiting. She wasn't looking at her with anger or satisfaction. She wasn't even gloating. She was simply watching, as if waiting to see what kind of person Linda really was. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "Well?" he asked. "What's it going to be, Miss Thompson?" Linda swallowed. She had never been in this position before. She had always been the one making decisions, controlling situations. But now, she was at their mercy. And for the first time in years, she had to admit something to herself. She didn't like the person she had become. She took a slow breath, then pushed the folder back toward Daniel. "I want to do the work," she said quietly. "Not just for the job, for myself." Amina and Daniel exchanged a glance. "You're sure?" Daniel asked. "This isn't just about keeping your job?" Linda shook her head. Yes, of course I want my job back. But this has made me realize something." She gestured to the folder. "All these complaints? I ignored them because I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was just enforcing the rules. But I see it now." She exhaled, her shoulders dropping. "I made decisions about people without even thinking. And that's not the kind of person I want to be." Amina studied her for a long moment, then finally spoke. "Then prove it." Linda nodded. "I will." Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. Then, with a small nod, he pulled a document from his briefcase and slid it across the table. "This is your agreement," he said. "You'll be on unpaid suspension for the next 3 months. You'll be required to complete bias training, diversity education, and customer relations workshops." Linda reached for the paper, skimming through the text. Daniel continued. "Once your training is completed, you'll undergo a final review. If we believe you've actually changed, you'll be reinstated, but you won't return as a senior flight attendant. You'll start at a lower rank and earn your way back up." Linda's stomach twisted at that. She had worked so hard for her position. The idea of starting over was painful. But wasn't that the whole point? She had used her position as a shield, as a way to justify the way she treated passengers. Maybe losing that authority was exactly what she needed. She nodded slowly. "I understand." Amina tapped a finger against the table. "And just so we're clear, if you try to coast through this without actually learning anything, if you show up just to check boxes but don't actually change..." Daniel finished the sentence for her. "Then you're done, permanently." Linda swallowed. "I won't waste this chance." Daniel slid a pen toward her. "Then sign it." Linda hesitated only for a moment before picking up the pen and signing her name. It was done. She had chosen the hard road. 3 months later, the airport felt different as Linda walked through the terminal, clutching a folder filled with certificates, bias training, diversity awareness, customer service retraining. She had completed every requirement Carter Aviation had set for her. But had she actually changed? That was what today was about. She approached the corporate offices, her nerves on edge. The past 3 months had been the hardest of her career. She had been forced to sit in rooms where people told stories of being treated exactly the way she had treated Amina. She had listened, uncomfortable, but unable to look away. as people described the humiliation of being judged, of being ignored, of being dismissed. She had thought about Amina every single day. When she finally reached the reception desk, the assistant gave her a nod. "Mr. Carter is expecting you." She took a deep breath and stepped into the conference room. Daniel Carter sat at the head of the table, flipping through a file. Amina was there too, arms crossed, watching her with an unreadable expression. Linda took a seat. Daniel set the folder down. "You completed all the training." "Yes, sir," Linda said. He nodded. "And what did you learn?" Linda hesitated. She could have rattled off a list of corporate-approved answers, but that wasn't what he was asking. He wanted to know if she had actually learned something. She glanced at Amina. The girl hadn't said anything yet, but Linda could tell she was waiting for the truth. Linda exhaled. "I learned that I never actually saw my passengers before." "Not really." Daniel raised an eyebrow, motioning for her to continue. Linda licked her lips, her hands tightening in her lap. "I thought I was just enforcing the rules. But the truth is, I was deciding who was worthy of certain treatment and who wasn't, and I never realized how much harm that caused." Amina leaned forward slightly. "So if I walked onto one of your flights tomorrow and sat in first class, what would you do?" Linda met her eyes. "I'd offer you a drink just like everyone else. And I'd assume you belong there, because you do." For the first time, Amina gave a small, approving nod. Daniel studied her for a moment longer. Then he closed the file. "You're reinstated," he said, "but under probation. You'll start at a junior position. No special privileges, no fast-track promotions. You'll have to prove over time that you deserve to be here." Linda nodded. "I understand." Daniel stood. "Then we're done here." Amina stood as well, grabbing her bag. She paused before leaving and turned back to Linda. "You know," Amina said, a hint of amusement in her voice, "I wasn't even thirsty that day, but I'm glad you finally got around to offering me a drink." Linda let out a small chuckle. "Took me long enough, huh?" Amina smirked. "Yeah, it did." Then she left, walking side by side with her father. Linda remained in the room for a few moments, taking it all in. She wasn't the same person who had stepped onto that flight months ago. She wasn't sure if she'd ever be. And maybe that was a good thing. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in this situation? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.